And the ashes of London. Picture, if you will, a quarry on the Isle of Portland. The morning mist clings to limestone cliffs as workers in rough-spun clothing and to their ancient craft, picks striking stone, chisels carving away centuries of sediment, the air thick with pale dust that catches the early light like powdered silver. Each block they free from the earth weighs more than a carriage, yet will one day soar 300 feet above the streets of London. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. You've put down your phone at last, the final email sent, the last fire extinguished for today. Your body knows it's time to rest, but your mind carries the weight of what you're building into these quiet hours. The questions that have no easy answers, the decisions that will shape tomorrow and the day after that. Tonight, let me tell you about another kind of builder, a man who faced destruction on a scale that would humble even our darkest moments of doubt. His name was Christopher Wren, and his story begins not with triumph, but with ashes. It was September 1666 when London burned. Not the London you might imagine today, with its wide boulevards and brick facades, but a medieval city of timber and thatch, where houses leaned so close across narrow streets that neighbors could shake hands from their upper windows. A city that had grown organically over 1,000 years, layer upon layer, like sediment in those Portland quarries. The fire started in a bakery on Pudding Lane, a simple accident. An oven not properly banked for the night. But London had seen no rain for months. The timber was tinder dry, and an east wind carried the flames from house to house, street to street, parish to parish. For 4 days, the city burned. Imagine standing on the south bank of the Thames, watching 1,000 years of history dissolve into smoke and flame. The medieval guild halls where craftsmen had gathered for centuries, gone. The markets where merchants had traded since Roman times, ash, 13,000 houses reduced to rubble and cinder. But perhaps most heartbreaking of all was the loss of old St. Paul's Cathedral. For 600 years, it had dominated London's skyline. Its spire stretched higher than any building in Europe, so tall that ships navigating the Thames used it as a landmark 20 miles out to sea. Inside, its nave could hold 4,000 worshippers, and its walls had witnessed the prayers of kings and commoners alike. When the flames reached St. Paul's, something extraordinary happened. The cathedral's lead roof, tons upon tons of it, began to melt. Molten metal poured down the walls like silver tears, pooling on the stone floor below. The heat was so intense that it turned the ancient stones themselves into lime, cracking the very foundations. By the morning of September 6th, when the flames finally died, old St. Paul's was a hollow shell. Its walls stood like broken teeth against the smoky sky, and where once the greatest cathedral in England had soared, there was only emptiness. Christopher Wren was 34 years old when he walked through those ruins. Not yet the master architect history would remember, but a professor of astronomy at Oxford, a man more comfortable with telescopes than building sites, more at home calculating the orbits of planets than the stresses in stone. Yet as he picked his way through the rubble of St. Paul's, something stirred in him. Perhaps it was the mathematician in him, seeing patterns where others saw only chaos. Perhaps it was something deeper, the recognition that from destruction comes the possibility of creation. You know this feeling, don't you? That moment when everything you've built seems fragile, when the weight you carry feels almost unbearable, when you wonder if what you're creating will survive the next challenge, the next setback, the next crisis that keeps you awake at 2 a.m. Wren stood in those ruins and made a choice that would define not just his life, but the very skyline of London. He would rebuild St. Paul's Cathedral, not as it was, but as it could be, better, stronger, more beautiful than anything that had come before. But first, he had to convince a city, a church, a king, and perhaps most difficult of all, himself. The London that emerged from the ashes was not the London that burned. Christopher Wren didn't just rebuild St. Paul's, he redesigned 51 parish churches, each one a masterpiece of proportion and light. But his greatest challenge, his defining work, would be the cathedral itself. The old St. Paul's had been Gothic, all soaring arches and mysterious shadows. Wren envisioned something revolutionary for England, a Baroque cathedral that would rival St. Peter's in Rome, crowned with a dome that had never been attempted on English soil. His critics were numerous and vocal. The church authorities wanted a simple restoration of the Gothic original. The city aldermen worried about the cost. The craftsmen doubted whether English workers could master such sophisticated techniques. But Wren had seen something in those ruins that others had missed. He understood that great buildings, like great enterprises, are not just about solving immediate problems. They're about creating something that will endure long after their creators are gone. Night after night, by candlelight in his study, Wren drew and calculated and dreamed. He studied the mathematics of dome construction, learning from Brunelleschi's work in Florence, from Michelangelo's achievements in Rome. He corresponded with the greatest architects of Europe, gathering knowledge like a merchant gathering precious cargo. And slowly, gradually, his vision began to take shape. The foundation stone of the new St. Paul's was laid in 1675, 9 years after the fire. Wren was 43 years old, no longer the young academic who had walked through the ruins, but a man seasoned by years of negotiation, compromise, and relentless problem-solving. The work would take 35 years to complete, 35 years of daily decisions, of setbacks and breakthroughs, of managing craftsmen and materials and budgets and politics. 35 years of carrying the weight of London's greatest architectural ambition. Think about that for a moment. 35 years, longer than most of our careers, longer than some of our lifetimes. Wren began the cathedral as a young man and saw it completed when his hair was white and his hands shook with age. What sustained him through those decades? What kept him going when the dome's construction seemed impossible, when funding dried up, when critics questioned every decision? Perhaps it was the stoic wisdom he would have learned in his classical education, the understanding that we cannot control outcomes, only our responses. That excellence is not a destination, but a daily practice, that the work itself, done well and with integrity, is its own reward. Or perhaps it was simpler than that. Perhaps it was the vision he carried in his mind, the image of what St. Paul's could become. On the darkest days, when problems seemed insurmountable, he could close his eyes and see it complete. The great dome rising above London, the interior flooded with light, the perfect marriage of engineering and beauty that would inspire generations yet unborn. In those Portland quarries, the work never stopped. Season after season, year after year, the quarrymen cut the pale limestone that would become St. Paul's bones. Each block was shaped with infinite care, knowing it would bear the weight of the structure above. The stone travelled by ship up the Thames, then by cart through London's rebuilding streets to the cathedral site. Wren was there almost every day, watching the walls rise course by course. He knew every stone, every joint, every stress and strain in the growing structure. This was not architecture by committee or design by consensus. This was one man's vision, refined by experience but never compromised, growing toward the light like a living thing. The dome presented challenges that had never been solved in England. How do you support such massive weight? How do you create a structure that appears to float while bearing the load of tons of stone and lead? Wren's solution was ingenious. Not one dome, but 3, nested inside each other like Russian dolls. An inner dome of brick, a middle cone of stone for structural support, and an outer shell of timber and lead that created the perfect profile against the London sky. It was a solution that could only have come from a mind that understood both the poetry and the mathematics of building, the romance and the reality, the vision and the engineering. As you lie here tonight, carrying the weight of your own ambitions, remember this. Every great thing that has ever been built started with someone lying awake, wondering if it was possible. Someone calculating risks and resources, dreaming of what could be while wrestling with what is. Wren's cathedral would become the masterpiece of English Baroque architecture. Its dome would define London's skyline for centuries. Its interior would host the funerals of Nelson and Wellington, the wedding of Prince Charles and Lady Diana, the Thanksgiving services that marked great moments in British history. But all of that was still in the future as Wren walked through his growing cathedral in those early years. As he ran his hands along the rising walls and imagined the day when the last stone would be set in place. Tomorrow, the work would continue, stone by stone, decision by decision, day by day, building something meant to last forever, one careful choice at a time. Wren's vision, the great design. The vision came to Wren not all at once, but in layers. like morning light slowly revealing the contours of a familiar landscape. He had spent months walking the ruins, measuring the old foundations, calculating what could be salvaged and what must be built anew. The weight of expectation pressed upon him from all sides. The church commissioners wanted something grand but not too costly. The king desired a monument worthy of his reign, and the people of London, they simply wanted their cathedral back. But Wren saw something more, something that would rise beyond mere restoration. In his study, surrounded by treatises on Roman architecture and sketches of Italian domes, he began to draft what would become known as the Great Model Design. This was no timid reconstruction of what had been lost. This was a vision that reached toward the sublime. A cathedral that would marry the classical proportions he had studied with the soaring ambitions of Gothic tradition. A building that would speak not just to the faithful of his generation, but to centuries yet unborn. The design that emerged from those late nights was breathtaking in its audacity. A vast dome, not the modest cupola that might have satisfied lesser ambitions, but a dome that would rival St. Peter's in Rome itself. Beneath it, an interior space designed around perfect acoustics and sightlines, where every worshipper could see and hear clearly, where light would fall in calculated pools of reverence. Perhaps you know something of this feeling, when the solution to a problem that has consumed your thoughts suddenly crystallizes, when all the scattered pieces of research and reflection arrange themselves into something coherent and beautiful. That moment when vision transcends the merely practical and touches something eternal. Wren's great model was exactly that, a leap of imagination that transformed necessity into opportunity. But visions, as you well know, must navigate the treacherous waters of approval and funding. The commissioners who gathered to examine Wren's elaborate wooden model in 1673 were dead less than enthusiastic. Too expensive, they murmured, too radical, too foreign in its classical influences. Where were the familiar Gothic arches that had defined English sacred architecture for centuries? The rejection stung. But Wren understood the deeper currents at work. These were men rebuilding not just a cathedral, but their sense of national identity after the trauma of fire and plague. They wanted something that felt English, something that honored tradition even as it embraced the future. So Wren adapted. He produced what became known as the Warrant Design, a compromise that satisfied the commissioner's desire for a traditional Gothic structure while concealing his greater ambitions. The drawings showed a more modest building, topped with a simple spire rather than his magnificent dome. It was this design that received official approval in 1675, but Wren had negotiated a crucial clause in his warrant. He reserved the right to make ornamental changes as construction progressed. It was a masterpiece of strategic thinking. Wren knew that once construction began, once the foundations were laid and the walls began to rise, the momentum of the project would carry his true vision forward. He understood that sometimes the path to revolutionary change must be walked carefully, step by measured step. The first barges began arriving at the construction site in 1676, great flat-bottomed vessels loaded with Portland stone, that beautiful white limestone that would give the cathedral its distinctive appearance. The stone came from quarries on the Dorset coast, carved by skilled masons who understood that they were shaping something destined for permanence. Picture those barges making their way slowly up the Thames, pulled by teams of horses along the towpath, their precious cargo covered against the weather. The journey took days, and each load represented weeks of quarrying and carving. Stone by stone, the raw materials of Wren's vision were accumulating on the construction site. The work began with the foundations, massive trenches dug deep into London clay, then filled with ragstone and mortar. This was unglamorous work, invisible to future generations, but Wren supervised it with the same attention he would later give to the soaring arches. He understood that everything above ground would depend on what lay hidden below. As the walls began to rise, Wren's true intentions slowly revealed themselves. The proportions were subtly different from the approved drawings. The structural supports were being positioned not for a simple spire, but for something far more ambitious. The commissioners, visiting the site, began to suspect that their architect had intentions beyond his warrant. But by then, the logic of the emerging structure made retreat impossible. This is perhaps the most instructive aspect of Wren's approach. the way he embedded his greater vision within seemingly modest beginnings. He knew that bold dreams often require patient execution, that sometimes the most revolutionary changes must be introduced gradually, allowing others time to adjust their expectations to match your expanding reality. The work proceeded through seasons and years. Winter froze the mortar, forcing delays. Summer brought longer working days, but also the risk of materials drying too quickly. Spring and autumn offered the best conditions, and it was during these seasons that the most dramatic progress was made. Wren was on site almost daily, consulting with master masons, adjusting details, solving the endless practical problems that arise when vision meets reality. How to lift massive stones to increasing heights. How to ensure that walls rising over decades would remain perfectly aligned. How to maintain quality when the work would span not just years but decades. Each challenge required innovation. Wren designed new lifting mechanisms, developed improved mortars, created systems for training craftsmen to maintain consistent standards across the long timeline of construction. He was not just the cathedral's architect. He was its chief engineer, its project manager, its keeper of standards, but perhaps most importantly, he was its guardian of vision. When costs mounted and commissioners suggested simplifications, Wren found ways to preserve what mattered most while yielding on lesser points. When craftsmen proposed easier alternatives to complex details, he patiently explained why the extra effort would serve the building's ultimate purpose. When critics questioned his departures from Gothic tradition, he demonstrated how classical proportions would create spaces of unprecedented beauty and functionality. The dome. His secret obsession began to take shape not in stone, but in the careful positioning of supports throughout the building. Long before its outline would be visible from the streets of London, the dome existed in the precise placement of pillars, in the calculated thickness of walls, in the hidden framework that would one day carry its enormous weight. By 1685, nearly a decade into construction, the basic structure was becoming undeniably magnificent. The commissioners, who had once worried about Wren's departures from approved plans, now found themselves proud advocates for his vision. What had seemed radical in drawings revealed itself as inevitable in 3 dimensions. The lesson here, the one that perhaps speaks to your own late-night wrestlings with ambitious plans, is that great visions require not just courage, but patience. The ability to hold your ultimate destination clearly in mind while navigating the practical compromises that each day demands. To know when to push and when to yield, when to reveal your full intentions and when to let your work speak for itself. Wren's cathedral was rising stone by stone, but it was also rising decision by decision. Each day brought choices that would echo through centuries. The curve of an arch, the placement of a window, the thickness of a wall. And each choice was made by a man who carried the complete vision in his mind, even when others could see only the work immediately at hand. The weight you carry, the responsibility for decisions whose consequences will unfold long after you've made them. This is the burden and the privilege of those who build lasting things. Wren understood this weight intimately. Every stone set in place was a commitment to the future, a promise that this building would serve purposes not yet imagined, shelter prayers not yet spoken, inspire generations not yet born. As evening fell over the construction site in those early years, Wren would often walk through the rising walls one final time, checking the day's work, yes, but also simply being present with what was emerging. Letting his eyes trace the lines that would one day frame soaring spaces, his hands touch stones that would outlast empires. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new opportunities to serve the vision that had taken hold of his imagination. The work was far from finished. Indeed, it was barely begun, but already in the careful placement of each stone, in the precise alignment of each wall, the future cathedral was declaring itself. Stone by stone, the impossible was becoming inevitable. And, laying the foundation. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Wren's study, casting long shadows across the drafting table where the future of London's skyline lay scattered in precise ink drawings. Each sheet represented months of calculation, years of refinement. But drawings, however beautiful, however mathematically perfect, were merely dreams until transformed into stone and mortar. And what stone it would be. Wren had made a decision that would define not just the appearance of his cathedral, but its very character for centuries to come. Portland stone, that luminous limestone quarried from the cliffs of Dorset, some 100 miles southwest of London. It was a choice that spoke to both his architectural vision and his understanding of permanence. You know this feeling, don't you? Standing at the threshold between planning and execution, when the weight you carry shifts from possibility to commitment, when the materials you choose, the people you trust, the standards you set, all become the foundation upon which everything else will rest. Portland stone was not the obvious choice. Local ragstone would have been cheaper, more readily available. But Wren had seen how the Great Fire had tested materials, how some had crumbled while others endured. He had walked through the ruins, touching walls that had stood for centuries only to fail when truly tested. The cathedral he was building would not merely survive, it would endure. The stone itself was remarkable. Formed over millions of years from the shells of ancient sea creatures, it possessed a unique quality. It actually hardened when exposed to London's sooty air. Where other stones would darken and decay, Portland stone would grow stronger, its surface developing a protective skin that would preserve the carved details for generations yet unborn. But choosing the stone was only the beginning. The logistics of moving thousands upon thousands of tons of limestone from the quarries of Dorset to the heart of London. This was a challenge that would test every aspect of Wren's organizational abilities. Picture, if you will, the quarries themselves. Men working with hammer and chisel, splitting stone along its natural grain. Each block carefully inspected, measured, marked according to its intended purpose. The rough blocks would be loaded onto ox-drawn carts, beginning their slow journey to the coast. From there, barges would carry them along England's rivers and around her coastline to the Thames. Then up that great artery to the very heart of the city. It was a supply chain of staggering complexity for its time. Weather could delay shipments for weeks. River levels could strand barges laden with precious cargo. A single mistake in measurement at the quarry could mean months of delay as replacement stones were cut and transported. And yet, stone by stone, the materials began to arrive. It was here that Wren encountered Edward Strong the Elder, a master mason whose name would become inseparable from the cathedral's construction. Strong was not merely a craftsman. He was an artist in stone, a man who could look at a rough block of limestone and see within it the delicate tracery of a window, the bold curve of an arch, the intricate foliation of a capital. The relationship between architect and master mason, it's one of the most crucial partnerships in any great building project. Wren provided the vision, the mathematical precision, the overall design. But Strong understood how stone wanted to be shaped, how it would respond to chisel and weather, how one block would sit upon another across the decades. Their first meeting was telling. Wren had spread his drawings across a makeshift table at the building site, plans showing the intricate stonework required for the cathedral's facade. Strong studied them in silence, his weathered hands tracing the lines, his experienced eye calculating not just what was drawn, but what it would mean in 3 dimensions, under load, through London's harsh winters. "It can be done," Strong finally said, and in those 4 words lay the commitment that would drive the next 3 decades of construction. You understand this moment, don't you? When someone looks at what you're building, truly looks at it, and sees not just the impossibility, but the path through the impossibility. When expertise meets vision and says, "Yes, we can do this." Strong brought with him not just his own skills, but an entire network of craftsmen. Stonemasons and carvers, apprentices and journeymen, men who had learned their trade on smaller churches and civic buildings, but who now found themselves part of something unprecedented in English architecture. The organization required was immense. Each stone had to be cut to precise specifications, but those specifications existed only in Wren's mind and on his drawings. There were no standard measurements, no prefabricated components. Every archstone, every column drum, every carved detail was unique, designed for its specific location in the grand design. Strong established workshops around the cathedral site, covered areas where stonemasons could work regardless of weather. The sound of chisel on stone became the constant music of the construction, a rhythm that would continue, with barely a pause, for 35 years. The apprenticeship system ensured continuity. Young men who began learning their craft on the cathedral's foundations would, decades later, be master craftsmen carving the final details of the dome. Skills were passed from hand to hand, generation to generation, each man adding his expertise to the collective knowledge required to realize Wren's vision. But it wasn't just about individual craftsmanship. The scale of the project demanded innovation in organization, in logistics, in the very way such work was managed. Wren found himself not just designing a cathedral, but designing the systems that would build it. Stone-cutting schedules had to be coordinated with construction progress. Weather delays in Dorset had to be anticipated and planned for. Quality control became paramount. A single poorly cut stone could compromise an entire section of wall. The master mason's mark became crucial, each craftsman's personal symbol carved discreetly into his work, not from vanity, but from accountability. Centuries later, these marks would tell the story of who built what, a permanent record of individual contribution to collective achievement. And slowly, very slowly, the cathedral began to rise. The foundations, those invisible roots of the great building, were completed with methodical precision. Each stone was laid in its bed of mortar, checked for level, aligned with mathematical accuracy. The walls began to climb, first a few feet, then yards, taking shape according to Wren's carefully orchestrated plan. There were setbacks, of course, stones that arrived damaged from transport, weather that halted work for weeks at a time, craftsmen who left for other projects, taking their skills and experience with them. Each challenge required adaptation, problem-solving, the kind of persistent creativity that separates ambitious dreams from completed realities. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect was the patience, the long-term thinking that the project demanded from everyone involved. This wasn't work that would be completed in months or even years. Men were committing their careers, their working lives, to something they might not live to see finished. And yet they came, day after day, season after season. The stonemasons arrived at the site, took up their tools and continued the work, each man contributing his small part to something immeasurably larger than himself. Wren understood this psychology, this need to see daily progress within an impossibly long-term project. He ensured that completed sections were finished to their full detail, so that even as other parts remained rough framework, portions of the cathedral stood in their final glory. Proof that the vision was not just possible, but beautiful. The weight of responsibility he carried. You recognize it, don't you? Not just the technical challenges, but the human ones. Keeping skilled craftsmen motivated across decades of work. Maintaining quality standards when the temptation might be to compromise for speed. Holding fast to the original vision while adapting to countless practical realities. This is the crucible in which great works are forged, not in the initial inspiration, but in the daily commitment to excellence when the work is hard and progress feels slow. In the decision to use the finest materials even when cheaper alternatives beckon. In the patience to build properly rather than quickly. As winter approached that first year of construction, Wren would walk the site in the evening light, examining the day's progress, planning tomorrow's challenges. The walls were still low, the great dome still decades in the future. But already, in the precision of the stonework, in the quality of the craftsmanship, in the dedication of the men who were building it, the character of the finished cathedral was declaring itself. The foundation was more than stone and mortar. It was a foundation of commitment, of skill, of shared purpose. And upon that foundation, the impossible would continue its slow transformation into the inevitable. Tomorrow would bring new stones from Portland, new challenges in their placement, new opportunities to serve the vision that had captured not just Wren's imagination, but the dedication of every craftsman whose chisel shaped the future. The dome takes shape. As the years passed and the walls rose higher, a new challenge presented itself to Wren, one that would test not only his architectural genius, but the courage of every man who would climb toward the heavens to make his vision real. The dome, that magnificent crown that would define London's skyline for centuries to come. But first, it had to be built, stone by stone, timber by human hands working at heights that made the city below seem like a child's toy. Picture, if you will, the scene that greeted visitors to the cathedral site in those middle years of construction. What had once been the ordered geometry of foundation stones had transformed into something that resembled a vast wooden forest, a forest that climbed impossibly high into the London sky. Scaffolding, miles upon miles of oak and elm, lashed together with rope and iron, creating a labyrinthine structure that enclosed the rising cathedral like a second building. From the street, passers-by could barely glimpse the stone walls within. So dense was this wooden cocoon that protected and supported the work. And climbing through this timber forest, like industrious ants on the branches of some great tree, were the craftsmen. Masons carrying their tools in leather satchels, labourers hefting blocks of Portland stone, carpenters with planes and chisels, all of them moving with the careful, measured pace of men who knew that a single misstep meant not just injury, but death. This was the world that John Oliver inhabited. Master carpenter, architect of impossibility, the man whose wooden structures would hold up Wren's stone dreams until they could stand on their own. If Wren was the mind of this great work, and Edward Strong its hands, then Oliver was its backbone, the one who made it possible for others to work safely at heights that challenged the very notion of what human beings could achieve. Oliver understood something that perhaps even Wren had not fully grasped when he first sketched his soaring dome, that before you can build in stone, you must first build in wood. Before the permanent, the temporary. Before the eternal, the scaffolding that makes eternity possible. Watch him now, in your mind's eye, as he studies the rising walls and calculates angles, loads, stresses. His weathered hands trace the air, sketching invisible structures that will support structures yet to come. He is building not just with timber, but with mathematics, with an intuitive understanding of forces and counterforces that no university could teach. The dome that Wren envisioned was not one dome, but three. An inner dome of brick, visible from within the cathedral, an outer dome of lead and timber, visible from the streets of London, and between them a cone of brick that would bear the weight of both. A hidden masterpiece that no one would ever see, but upon which everything depended. To build such a thing required scaffolding that was itself an architectural marvel. Oliver's wooden framework had to be strong enough to support not just the weight of materials, but the weight of possibility itself. It had to allow access to every angle, every curve, every precise point where stone would meet stone in perfect harmony. The logistics alone were staggering. Imagine coordinating the delivery of timber to a site already crowded with stone, mortar, tools, and hundreds of workers. Imagine calculating the precise dimensions needed for scaffolding that would curve with the dome's graceful arc. Scaffolding that would have to be dismantled piece by piece as the permanent structure took its place. And imagine the trust required, the absolute faith that these temporary wooden structures would hold firm while men worked overhead with blocks of stone weighing hundreds of pounds each. The workers themselves developed their own culture, their own rhythms, within this wooden world. They learned to read the subtle sounds that timber makes under stress, the barely audible creaks that warned of overloading, the reassuring silence that meant all was well. They developed an almost supernatural sense of balance, moving along narrow planks with the confidence of sailors navigating a ship's rigging in a storm. There were accidents, of course. Men fell, tools dropped from great heights, embedding themselves in the ground below with a violence that reminded everyone of the stakes involved. But remarkably, considering the scale and danger of the work, there were fewer casualties than anyone had dared hope. Perhaps it was Oliver's meticulous planning. Perhaps it was the careful selection of workers. Or perhaps there was something about the nature of the work itself that called forth the best in those who undertook it. For these men were not just building a cathedral, they were participating in something larger than themselves, something that would outlast their own brief lives by centuries. They were craftsmen in service of a vision that transformed the very meaning of their daily labor. Consider the mason who spent his days shaping the curved stones that would form the dome's inner surface. Each stone had to be cut to precise specifications, not just in its visible dimensions, but in its hidden angles, the surfaces that would bear against its neighbors in the completed structure. A single error in calculation or execution could compromise the integrity of the entire dome. Yet this same mason, working high above London in Oliver's wooden scaffolding, was also an artist. His chisel marks, invisible once the stone was set in place, were nonetheless made with the care of someone who understood that quality in the unseen details determines the strength of the whole. Or consider the laborers who hauled materials up through the maze of scaffolding, rope and pulley systems that Oliver had designed to distribute weight and effort across multiple points. These men developed muscles that were sculpted by the specific demands of their work. Their hands grew calloused in patterns unique to their craft. Their eyes learned to judge distances and angles with an accuracy that rivaled any instrument. They were becoming something new, craftsmen shaped by the cathedral even as they shaped it. The rhythm of the work was measured not in hours or days, but in seasons. Spring brought renewed energy after winter's enforced slowdown. Summer offered long days when work could continue deep into the evening. Autumn was the time for preparing materials and structures to withstand winter's assault, and winter itself became a time for planning, for solving problems, for dreaming of the work that spring would make possible again. Wren himself was a constant presence during these crucial years. Not content to remain in his office with his drawings and calculations, he climbed the scaffolding regularly, his aging body moving with surprising agility through Oliver's wooden framework. He needed to see, to touch, to verify that reality was matching vision at every stage. The workers grew accustomed to seeing their architect appear suddenly beside them, his keen eyes examining their work with an intensity that was never critical, always curious. Wren had the rare gift of understanding that the men who executed his designs often discovered improvements that no amount of theoretical planning could anticipate. He listened to their suggestions, incorporated their insights, allowed the cathedral to evolve even as it rose. This was collaboration on a scale that few projects in human history have achieved. Not the collaboration of equals, the social hierarchy of the time made that impossible, but the collaboration of different forms of expertise united in service of a common goal. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the dome began to take shape. The wooden centering that Oliver had constructed, the temporary curved framework upon which the permanent stone structure would rest until it could support itself, was a masterpiece in its own right. Visitors who were permitted to climb the scaffolding often gasped when they first saw it, this perfect wooden echo of the dome that would eventually replace it. But Oliver knew, even as he admired his own craftsmanship, that success would be measured by how completely his work could be forgotten. The centering would be dismantled, the scaffolding would be taken down, his wooden masterpiece would disappear, leaving behind only the stone structure it had made possible. This is perhaps the deepest lesson that the cathedral's construction offers to those who carry the weight of their own ambitions, that the most crucial work is often the work that remains invisible, the foundations that no one sees, the scaffolding that gets taken down, the temporary structures that make permanent achievements possible. As you lie there now, feeling the weight of all that you're building, remember Oliver and his wooden forest. Remember that the infrastructure of success, the systems and relationships and patient daily practices that support your vision, may never receive recognition, but they are no less essential for their invisibility. The dome continued its patient rise through those middle years, supported by Oliver's scaffolding, shaped by Strong's masons, guided by Wren's unwavering vision. And with each stone set in place, London gained not just a cathedral, but a demonstration of what becomes possible when temporary structures serve permanent purposes, when individual skills unite in service of something larger than any one person could achieve alone. Tomorrow would bring new challenges in the dome's construction, new tests of engineering and courage, new opportunities for craftsmen to discover what they were truly capable of when called to work at the very limits of human possibility. Crafting the interior, but within the great cathedral taking shape, there was another kind of work beginning, work that would transform cold stone into something that could lift the human spirit. While the dome rose toward heaven above, artisans were turning their attention to the spaces where people would gather, where they would seek solace and meaning in their daily struggles. The interior of St. Paul's would not simply be a vast empty shell beneath that magnificent dome. Wren understood something profound about human nature, that we need beauty not just in grand gestures, but in the intimate details that catch the eye and quiet the restless mind. The cathedral would be filled with carvings and decorations, each one a small masterpiece, each one contributing to a greater harmony. In workshops scattered around London, master craftsmen were already at work on these interior treasures. The most celebrated among them was Grinling Gibbons, a woodcarver whose skill had caught the attention of the king himself. Gibbons possessed that rare combination of technical mastery and artistic vision, the ability to see life hiding within a block of limewood, waiting to be revealed by patient, knowing hands. Perhaps you understand this kind of vision, this ability to see potential where others see only raw material. In the weight you carry, in what you're building, there are moments when you must look beyond the immediate challenges, beyond the spreadsheets and the urgent emails, to glimpse the deeper purpose that drives your work forward. Gibbons would spend months on a single panel for the choir stalls, his chisel removing tiny curls of wood with each careful cut. Under his hands, limewood became cascading flowers, twisted ribbons, fruits so realistic they seemed ready to fall from their wooden branches. But these were not mere decorations, they carried meaning, symbols that spoke to anyone who took the time to really see them. The oak leaves he carved represented strength and endurance, qualities that Wren himself needed in abundance as the cathedral slowly took shape. The roses spoke of beauty emerging from thorns, of joy that could bloom even in difficult seasons. Palm fronds symbolized victory, not the quick triumph of a single battle, but the patient victory of those who persist when others give up. In the stone yards near the construction site, other artisans were creating their own contributions to the cathedral's interior beauty. The sound of hammers and chisels filled the air from dawn until dusk, a rhythm as steady and reassuring as a heartbeat. Master stonemasons shaped Portland stone into capitals for columns, each one unique, each one requiring weeks of careful work. These craftsmen understood something about excellence that speaks across the centuries. They knew that the work itself was a form of prayer, that taking pride in small details was not vanity but reverence. A leaf carved with perfect attention to its veins and texture, a flower shaped with understanding of how light would fall across its petals. These were acts of devotion to something larger than themselves. The apprentices in these workshops learned more than just technique. They absorbed a way of approaching work that transformed labor into craft, and craft into art. They learned to see each project not as a burden to be completed quickly, but as an opportunity to create something worthy of the great cathedral that would house it for centuries to come. Young men who might have spent their lives in ordinary carpentry or simple stonework found themselves part of something extraordinary. They discovered capabilities they never knew they possessed, patience they didn't know they had, standards of excellence that elevated everything they would create for the rest of their working lives. This is perhaps what happens when we're called to contribute to something truly meaningful. When the weight we carry is not just responsibility but privilege, the daily work becomes different, not easier, but infused with purpose that makes the long hours and difficult decisions feel worthwhile. In Gibbons' workshop, the master carver worked by candlelight long after his assistants had gone home. His hands moved with the confidence that comes from decades of practice, but his eyes held the concentration of someone who knew that this work would outlast him, that children not yet born would run their fingers along these carved surfaces, that people carrying their own invisible weight would find comfort in the beauty he was creating. The choir stalls he carved would become some of the finest examples of decorative woodwork in all of Europe. But more than that, they would become spaces where human voices would rise in harmony for generations, where the acoustics Wren had so carefully planned would transform individual songs into something transcendent. Each carved panel told part of a larger story, scenes from scripture, symbols of faith and hope, reminders that even in the darkest times, beauty persists, meaning endures, and human creativity can transform the most humble materials into something that speaks to the deepest parts of our nature. The stone carvers working on the interior columns faced their own unique challenges. Unlike the exterior stonework, which had to withstand London's weather and pollution, these interior pieces could be more delicate, more intricate. They could include fine details that would be lost on the cathedral's outer walls, subtle variations in texture and form that would reward close observation. Master masons like Edward Strong the Younger, son of the Edward Strong who had helped establish the cathedral's foundations, brought both inherited skill and fresh innovation to this work. They understood stone not just as building material, but as a medium for artistic expression, a way to add warmth and humanity to the cathedral's vast interior spaces. The capitals they carved for the interior columns bloomed with stone foliage, leaves and flowers that seemed to grow naturally from the limestone, as if the cathedral itself were a living thing, rooted in London's soil but reaching towards something eternal. These carvings would catch and reflect the light streaming through the cathedral's great windows, creating patterns of shadow and illumination that would change throughout the day, throughout the seasons. In workshops throughout the city, metalworkers were crafting the wrought iron gates and screens that would define different areas within the cathedral. Their work required a different kind of artistry, the ability to bend and shape iron into flowing curves, to create barriers that felt more like invitations, boundaries that enhanced rather than restricted the flow of space and light. These craftsmen heated iron in their forges until it glowed like sunset, then shaped it while it was still malleable, still responsive to their vision. They created scrollwork that seemed to dance, leaves and vines that appeared to grow from the iron itself, gates that were both functional and beautiful, practical and inspiring. The painters working on the cathedral's interior faced perhaps the greatest challenge of all. Their work would fill the spaces between stone and wood, would tie together all the different elements into a unified whole. They mixed pigments by hand, testing colors in different lights, understanding that their choices would affect how people felt when they entered this sacred space. The dome's interior required special attention, a painted surface that would be viewed from far below, that would need to maintain its impact across that vast distance. These artists studied perspective and proportion, light and shadow, creating images that would seem to float in the air above the cathedral's visitors, connecting earth and heaven through human artistry. Each brushstroke was considered, each color chosen with care. These painters knew that their work would be scrutinized by generations, that it would need to maintain its beauty and meaning long after they were gone. They approached their task with the same patient dedication that drove Wren himself, the same understanding that great work cannot be rushed, cannot be compromised by the pressure of deadlines or the temptation of shortcuts. As 1700 approached, these interior spaces began to reveal their true character. Visitors could walk through areas where the decoration was nearly complete, where Gibbons's carvings caught the light from the great windows, where stone and wood and metal came together in harmonious beauty, where every surface spoke of human skill applied with love and reverence. The cathedral was becoming more than the sum of its parts, more than stone and timber and lead. It was becoming a place where the weight that people carry could be set down for a moment, where the struggles of daily life could be seen in the context of something larger and more enduring, where beauty itself became a form of healing. Tomorrow would bring new challenges in coordinating all these different crafts, new opportunities for artisans to discover how their individual contributions fit into Wren's grand vision, new moments when the cathedral would reveal itself, not just as a building, but as a work of art on the grandest possible scale. Hacked, a legacy in stone, and so the years continued to unfold, each season bringing the cathedral closer to completion, each day revealing new details of what would become one of London's most enduring monuments. By 1708, more than 30 years after Wren first put pencil to paper, the final stone was ready to be set into place at the very top of the dome. The last stone, carved from the same Portland limestone that formed the foundation, carried with it the weight of every decision, every compromise, every moment of doubt and determination that had brought the cathedral to this point. Wren himself, now 76 years old, climbed the scaffolding one final time to witness this moment. His hands, once steady enough to draft the most intricate architectural details, now trembled slightly as he touched the stone that would complete his life's greatest work. Around him, the craftsmen who had become his extended family over these decades, Edward Strong the younger now carrying on his father's legacy, John Oliver's apprentices managing the final adjustments to the scaffolding, all gathered to witness what they had built together. The ceremony of completion was quiet, almost intimate, considering the magnitude of what had been achieved. There were no crowds, No fanfare, just the soft scraping of stone against stone as the final piece settled into its eternal resting place. The sound echoed through the dome, a whisper that seemed to say, "It is finished. It is good. It will endure." In the months that followed, as the scaffolding came down piece by piece, London began to see St. Paul's Cathedral as Wren had always envisioned it. The dome rose above the city like a gentle giant, its lead covering gleaming silver in the morning light, casting long shadows that moved across the streets below like the hands of some enormous clock, marking not just the hours, but the passage of history itself. The first service in the completed cathedral was held on December the 2nd, 1708, the feast day of St. Francis Xavier. As the great doors opened, and the first congregation stepped inside, there was a collective intake of breath, the space that had existed only in Wren's imagination for so long, that had been glimpsed in fragments as each section was completed, now revealed itself in its full glory. The light, filtered through the clear glass windows, fell across Grinling Gibbon's carvings like gentle fingers, illuminating details that seemed to come alive under its touch. The dome, viewed from below, created a sense of infinite space, as if the building itself was reaching toward something beyond the physical world. Every surface, every curve, every carefully calculated proportion worked together to create not just a building, but an experience, a feeling of being held within something both grand and intimate. The congregation that first morning included many of the craftsmen who had built the cathedral, their families, their children who had grown up playing in the shadow of the rising walls. Edward Strong stood with his sons, watching as light played across stones he had personally selected and set. Former apprentices, now master craftsmen themselves, pointed out to their own children the sections they had worked on, the particular challenges they had overcome, the moments when they had discovered what their hands could create when guided by a larger vision. But perhaps the most moving presence was that of the families of those who had not lived to see this day, the widows of craftsmen who had fallen from scaffolding, the children of stonemasons who had succumbed to lung disease from years of stone dust, the relatives of laborers who had simply worn themselves out in service to something they believed in. They stood in the completed cathedral, knowing that their loved ones lived on in every carefully cut stone, every precisely fitted joint, every detail that would endure long after all their names were forgotten. Wren himself moved through the space like a man in a dream. For more than 3 decades, this building had existed primarily in his mind, in his drawings, in the constant weight of responsibility he carried. Now, walking beneath the dome, he had calculated and recalculated countless times, running his fingers along walls whose every dimension he knew by heart. He experienced something like wonder at what had emerged from all those years of patient work. The cathedral was not just a building. It was a testament to what becomes possible when vision meets persistence, when individual skills are elevated by being part of something larger, when the daily work of ordinary people is guided by an extraordinary dream. Every person who had contributed, from the quarryman who first cut the stone to the artists who carved the final decorative details, had found their efforts magnified, their skills enhanced, their legacy secured by being part of this enduring whole. In the years that followed, as London grew and changed around it, St. Paul's Cathedral became more than Christopher Wren had ever imagined. It became a place where the city gathered in times of celebration and mourning, where individual lives intersected with history, where the temporary concerns of daily existence could be seen in the context of something permanent and beautiful. The building weathered storms that would have destroyed lesser structures, survived fires that consumed the buildings around it, stood firm through wars that shook the very foundations of the society that built it. Each generation discovered new meanings in its spaces, new comfort in its enduring presence, new inspiration in the knowledge that human hands and minds, working together with patience and dedication, could create something that transcends the limitations of any single lifetime. The craftsmen who built it aged and passed away, their tools handed down to sons and apprentices who would use them on other projects, other dreams, other monuments to human ambition and skill. But their work in the cathedral remained, as fresh and precise as the day they completed it, a permanent record of what they had been capable of achieving. Wren lived to see his cathedral become part of London's identity, to watch as it drew visitors from across the world who came simply to stand in the space he had imagined. He lived to see children who had been born after its completion bring their own children to marvel at the dome, to trace with small fingers the intricate carvings, to ask the questions that every generation asks when confronted with something beautiful and enduring. How was this made? Who built it? How long did it take? What were they thinking as they worked? And in those quiet moments, late in his life, when Wren would slip into the cathedral alone, walking through spaces that had once existed only in his dreams, he would sometimes pause and listen to the building itself. The way sound moved through the carefully calculated acoustics, the way light shifted as the sun traced its path across the sky, the way the building seemed to breathe, expanding slightly in the warmth of day, contracting gently in the cool of night, as if it had developed a life of its own. He would think about all the decisions, large and small, that had brought the cathedral into being, the choice of Portland stone that had given it its enduring strength and beauty, the decision to build the dome in 3 shells that had made its soaring height possible, the countless adjustments and refinements that had transformed his initial vision into something even more beautiful than he had first imagined. But mostly, he would think about the people. Edward Strong and his steady craftsmanship, John Oliver and his ingenious scaffolding, Grinling Gibbons and his transformative artistry, the hundreds of other craftsmen whose names were not recorded but whose skills were permanently embedded in every surface, the laborers who had carried materials, mixed mortar, cleared debris, day after day, year after year, until their individual efforts had accumulated into something magnificent. The cathedral had taught him something about the nature of great work, about how the most enduring achievements emerge not from moments of inspiration, but from the patient accumulation of daily efforts, from the willingness to persist even when progress seems impossibly slow, from the faith that individual contributions, however small, can become part of something larger and more meaningful than any single person could achieve alone. Now, as you rest, carrying the weight of your own vision, building something that exists first in your imagination and gradually takes shape through your daily efforts, you are part of the same tradition that built St. Paul's Cathedral, the same patience that guided Wren through 35 years of construction, the same persistence that kept craftsmen working even when progress seemed impossibly slow, the same faith in the value of careful, dedicated work. These qualities live on in everyone who commits themselves to building something meaningful and enduring. Your work, like theirs, is both temporary and permanent. Temporary in that each day's tasks are completed and left behind, permanent in that they accumulate, layer by layer, into something that will outlast your individual efforts, something that will provide value and meaning long after the daily struggles of its creation are forgotten. And so, as sleep begins to claim you, let yourself rest in the knowledge that great work has always required this same combination of vision and patience, this same willingness to persist through uncertainty, this same faith that individual efforts, guided by a larger purpose, can create something beautiful and enduring, something that justifies the weight you carry, something that honors the vision that keeps you working, day after day, building your own cathedral, one stone at a time, until it stands complete, beautiful, permanent, a testament to what becomes possible when human imagination meets human dedication, when temporary efforts create permanent value, when the work itself becomes a form of prayer, a way of adding something meaningful to the world, something that will endure long after you. Like Wren, like all the craftsmen who built St. Paul's, have found your own rest in the knowledge that what you built, what you gave, what you created through patient daily work, continues to provide shelter and inspiration and beauty for generations you will never meet but whose lives are enriched by what you chose to build.